Baby-headed centaurs, atoms, the spread of infectious disease. These were all ideas by the Greek poet slash philosopher slash all the other jobs at the time, Lucretius. Lucretius had some really crazy ideas about the world. At the regular growth rates of both a horse and a human, the horse would be fully developed at 3 years and there would be just a toddler body up on top of a horse. Yeah. When I first learned about Lucretius, it was through the lens of my Latin class. And one of the ways that he was brought up was this idea of like, hey, we think these ideas of atoms and the Earth not being the center of the universe are really kind of new, really kind of modern, but that's just not the case. These things were being talked about 2,000 years ago. Of course, because of the time that he was in, he was also hilariously wrong about some things, which we'll get into later in the video. But for now, I want to talk about each of his main theories that turned out to be true, so that we can all have our minds collectively blown. So Lucretius was kind of a guy that didn't think that we were like the center of attention, and that applies to humans as well as the universe. So one of his first theories was that the universe actually didn't have a center or edges, it just kind of existed and expanded. Yeah, that's exactly the case. How did you know? Now, Copernicus and Galileo found out that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe about 400 years ago, right? Like, the idea that the Earth orbits the sun is about 400 to 500 years old, depending on how, like, who you want to push that idea off onto. And then the idea that the sun isn't the center of the universe only happened like 100 years ago. That was, I think, Edwin Hubble that figured that out. Naturally, Lucretius didn't have access to, like, telescopes or mathematics that were used by a lot of those later scientists slash philosophers slash all of the jobs at the time. Lucretius had to use philosophy. It's like, how do you make these jumps using philosophy? Well, it's actually some really sound and really interesting philosophy. So, when he proposed that the universe was infinite, which was a little bit later, he gave the idea that if you're standing at the edge of the universe and you threw a spear and that spear stopped, then that spear would have had to have hit something, right? There would have been a wall. There would have been something at the edge of the universe, and there isn't, because you have to be able to throw your spear into nothingness, essentially, and nothing is not something, and something would stop the spear. That still blows my mind. I can't get my head around it now, and it's 2026. And then there's the idea of atoms, which philosophers all the way back to like Epicurus and before had kind of theorized about something that could not be split, of everything that we could see and touch and feel and look at. And then Lucretius comes around to this idea of atoms and gives them a set of principles, a set of things he believes, and he calls them corpus, bodies. And he says that everything in the universe is either made out of bodies or void. And at 2 a.m. I'm definitely a void-based being. So those 5 properties of atoms are going to be, they are invisible, they are indestructible, they are solid, and they are finite in shape variety, so there can only be so many different shapes, which is like exactly what we've learned about modern atoms. And then they are infinite in number, and that just goes back to his belief that the universe is infinite, that all stems from philosophy and no actual hard math or science. How did he do this? The way that like Lucretius interprets this stuff sometimes gives me the chills and makes me think that he was like from the future. Of course, Lucretius was a poet slash all of the other jobs at the time, and so he had a poem called De Retrum Natria, which I think is the return of nature. And in the final section of this poem, he talks about the plague of Athens, which took place in 430 BC. And in this poem, he describes what he calls the seeds of disease, or like simone morbi. Lucretius starts to take note of the fact that diseases are spreading from person to person and from place to place. And there's also climates where disease seems to spread more rapidly, like tropical and windy climates seem to carry illness better. Also, the Greeks at this point already knew that water could spread contagions. That's why when you hear about wine in a lot of the old poems, like the Odyssey or the Iliad, it's often cut with about 50% water, and they used it just to sterilize what they were drinking. Imagine getting absolutely sloshed with your friends after about 6.5 glasses of water. I mean water. So again, like 2,000 years ago, here's Lucretius saying like, hey guys, I think maybe disease spreads via little particles. And the rest of the world like largely ignores this, and then we get the Black Death in Europe. We're like, wow, wonder who we could have listened to. Germ theory wasn't properly even established until like the 1860s. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch were the two people that kind of laid the groundwork of this. And at this point in the video, you're probably thinking, hey, Lucretius, that guy was a freaking genius. He was brilliant. But now we're going to get into some of the fumbles and some of the misses that he had. And then we're also going to talk about the mythological stuff that he was working on, which was really interesting. And also like where this video gets its title. My favorite miss that Lucretius had was he looked at the sun and the moon and he was like, I bet those two things are about the same size that they appear to us. He genuinely thought that the sun and the moon were like 2 feet across and you could like hold them. Everyone spam the comments with clapping emojis for Lucretius. Lucretius also thought that the way we saw was like atoms shedding off of things and hitting our eyes, which I mean, it wasn't wrong if you consider photons is what he's describing as atoms, but photons being light particles are fundamentally different. They're wavelengths, not necessarily atoms themselves. And then he just believed that organic living creatures could arise from things like rocks, stones, mud, sticks, trees, that kind of thing, and that didn't age too well. Finally, the mythological stuff. So Lucretius was a believer in the theology of his time, which was the ancient Greek religion. So he started making some interesting observations. First, he made the observation that centaurs, a fully grown horse, develops at about 3 years, whereas humans develop at about 20, and so you'd have a 3-year-old toddler on top of a horse, and we'll get more into that in a second. And then he also talked about chimeras being fundamentally incompatible because you have a warm-blooded mammal mixed with a cold-blooded snake, and that's just not going to be a good circulatory system. So literally yesterday, as this video was coming out, I put up a short talking about this incongruence between the human being fully developed at 20 and the horse being fully developed at 3 years old, and I got some really fun comments in the comment section, so I thought we would just go through those to close out the video. The first comment that I love on here says, they also have 2 rib cages. Does that mean they have 4 lungs? I love it. Top tier. And yes, what does that mean about the other organs as well? Like, what is happening in a centaur? Do they have 2 hearts? Do they have 2 livers? Do they have 2 kidneys? How long are the freaking intestines on this thing? How does a man eat enough grass to keep the horse satisfied? How many stomachs does this thing have? I got real questions about a centaur. And then I have another comment here that says, I feel like both parts would develop at the same time in rhythm, let's be logical, but the question I ask myself is, horses are born able to walk and run. Human babies are born without any muscle strength and can't hold their own head up. So would the baby centaur gallop everywhere and flay, and the baby head would just be flaying around? Which is a fundamentally better question than Lucretius ever had, so thank you for that one. And anyway, this is the end of my video. If you liked it, please subscribe. I'm trying to get to 53 subscribers before Christmas. My favorite fun fact that didn't make it into this video was the works of Lucretius, and likely why you've never heard of him, were buried by the Catholic Church, by the early Catholic Church, because he presented a view of the world in which there were no gods, no order, no hierarchy, and it was just kind of random chaos with little diseases. So really, really ahead of his time, that directly conflicted with the dominance in the region that the Catholic Church was trying to achieve. And so, thusly, they buried his work. And if you like this video, I try and release 1 full-length video and a couple shorts every week. So if you want this kind of weird scientific knowledge, things to think about and wish you hadn't, that's what I'm here for. Also, comment down below how many times I've changed my hat in this video, because it has been more than 5. All right, I will see you all later. Peace!